Greetings, students, and welcome to my presentation on the African slave trade, which your reading did not do justice. This is an incredibly important phenomenon in world history, an incredibly important chapter in the story of humanity. I also want to give a little shout-out, formal citation, if you will, to Oregon Public Broadcasting. They created a really outstanding module called the Atlantic Slave Trade, and I'm borrowing a lot of information from the reading I did on their site to create this presentation. Now, the movement of Africans to the Americas is the second largest transoceanic migration in history. Now put that into perspective. That's a pretty bold statement. But what makes this migration unique is its involuntary nature, the high rates of mortality of participants, the social dislocation it created, and the methods of capture and transportation. So this is a hugely important and bizarre and incredible topic. So here's the two essential questions we're going to deal with. First, what were the pull factors, the factors outside of Africa that created the demand for slaves? And then what are the push factors, the factors inside Africa that created the supply of African slaves for this trade? David Eltis posed in a 1983 article a striking contrast in the population of the Americas. By 1820, there had been, get this, 8.4 million African immigrants to the Americas. By 1820, there were only 2.4 million European immigrants. But by that date, European American population numbered 12 million. African American population numbered 11 million. So put this in perspective. There are 4 times more Africans coming to the Western Hemisphere than there are Europeans, but there's more Europeans surviving. This speaks volumes about the treatment of Africans both on the way to America and once they got here. And here's a term that you may have heard in another history class. It's the concept of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is a triangular trade between West Africa, the Americas, South and North America, the Caribbean, and Europe. Europeans came to Africa with manufactured goods and money, in which they purchased African slaves who were then transported to the Western Hemisphere. Then the Western Hemisphere shipped back agricultural products, raw materials to Europe. So that's the complete triangle of what we call the Middle Passage. Now, when you talk economics, you talk about pull factors. What you're talking about is demand. Why do people want to purchase anything? And we're going to take that same tact here and talk about the pull factors. The pull factors were outside of Africa, which created demand for African slaves. Most work of slaves in the Western Hemisphere could be categorized into the following occupations. Many worked in South American mining. There was plantation work in South America, but mainly in the Caribbean and North America. Artisanal work, that just means blacksmiths, cobblers. That was more prevalent in South America than North America, although there were North American artisan slaves. And finally, domestic service throughout the Western Hemisphere. As these industries, particularly agriculture with cotton and tobacco, became more profitable, the demand for African slaves soared. Now, one thing that is coupled with this is the absolute decimation of Native Americans. This is an amazing statistic. Despite the immigration of Europeans and Africans to the Western Hemisphere, the total population of the Americas, that's North, South, Central, Caribbean, declined in the 16th and 17th centuries. While estimates of the pre-Columbian, that's before the Spanish came, populations must remain speculative, the population of the Americas fell from, get this, perhaps 80 million just prior to the Spanish arrived to as little as 5 million people in the 17th century. The chief reason for this massive mortality was the introduction of new infectious disease from Europe and Africa. Now get this, people, this created this massive void in labor. This void was filled by African slaves. This was the huge demand. So you have two factors. Number one, products from the Western Hemisphere are becoming increasingly in demand in Europe, and there just aren't enough laborers in the Western Hemisphere to process these commodities. So now let's talk about push factors. And push factors have to do with factors inside of Africa that fuel the supply of African slaves. It's essential that students understand the following. There was slavery in Africa prior to this massive slave trade. Before the 17th century, however, sub-Saharan African societies lacked the powerful states and the lucrative trade routes necessary to support an extensive system of slavery. There was an exception. It's the western part of Africa, particularly the Songhai Empire. One of the sources of revenue for the Songhai Empire was to trade slaves up through the Sahara Desert. But with the exception of Western Africa, slavery in Africa was marginal. By the mid-17th century, that's 1650, demand for slaves in the Western Hemisphere had surpassed demands for slaves in the Sahara. So now you start to see this pivot from the north to the west, and this voracious appetite for African slaves coming from the Western Hemisphere. The dramatic expansion in demand for slaves in America inspired Africans to create an expanded network of slave supply. And this permitted, and this is crucial, wealthy Africans to buy slaves in unprecedented numbers. The movement of so many slaves to the African coast for export entailed large-scale capture and migration, taking individuals, humanity, from the interior parts of Africa and transporting them to the coast where they would be exchanged with European slave traders and shipped off to the New World. So wealthy Africans did play a huge role in the slave trade. That's essential to understand that. So the question is, where did they get these people? Africa has traditionally been subject to dry periods which create incredible hardship. Although it's hard to fathom doing this, there were times when people in sub-Saharan Africa, in states of desperation, would sell themselves or sell their children to slave traders. This was a way to get money so your larger family could survive. That did happen. And then the other source of slavery was just captured enemies. Also, criminals could be sentenced to slavery. So you could clean out the jails, you could dispose of prisoners of war, and then you also could buy people literally from desperate families. One of the hottest debates that has erupted in academia over the issue of slavery, over the issue of push factors inside of Africa is, did the slave trade inspire violence? In other words, did wealthy local rulers start wars for the sole purpose of obtaining captives that then could be traded to European slave traders for incredible amounts of money? This, of course, led then to huge divisions of wealth between those local rulers who exploited the slave trade and the vast majority of the population that were in large part victims of the slave trade. The impact on Africa is fascinating. You know, this was a time period, 17th, 18th, 19th century, where the world population is starting to erupt thanks to increased standards of living due to the Industrial Revolution, with one exception, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. The population of Africa stayed stagnant because so many individuals were being siphoned off and sent to other parts of the world involuntarily.